In 1964, 36 Canadian companies were making washing machines, stoves, and refrigerators in Ontario and Quebec, employing 10,000 workers. Their factories hummed across the cities of Hamilton, London, Weston, and Montreal. Their products sat in the kitchens of every Canadian family from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific shore. Today, that number is effectively zero, not consolidated, not restructured, gone. The buildings on Longwood Road in Hamilton, Ontario, where Canada's last great appliance manufacturing empire stood for nearly a century, are now research laboratories and startup incubators. Where assembly lines once ran 24 hours a day, software engineers now sit in ergonomic chairs. Where workers drove forklifts loaded with refrigerators bound for markets across North America, academics in lab coats study battery technology and automotive materials. The transformation is total. The industrial era that built those walls has been completely erased from the address. This is the story of Camco, the Canadian Appliance Manufacturing Company, the largest producer of major home appliances in Canadian history. A company that was born from the merger of giants in December of 1976, that captured 30% of the Canadian appliance market at its peak, that employed over 2,000 people across multiple provinces, and that produced refrigerators, stoves, and dryers under the names that sat in every Canadian kitchen: General Electric, Hotpoint, Moffat, and McClary, a company that posted $500 million in sales in 1986, becoming the first Canadian appliance manufacturer ever to cross that threshold. And then, in December of 2004, the Hamilton plant closed. 800 workers lost their jobs in a single announcement. The largest appliance factory in Ontario went dark. The stock of Camco, listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange under the symbol COC, collapsed nearly 48% in a single trading day, from $2.20 to a low of $1.15. The machinery of import competition from China, Mexico, and South Korea had done what 2 strikes, 3 recessions, and decades of trade negotiation could not. It had killed the factory. This is the story of how Canada built, sustained, and ultimately surrendered the dream of manufacturing its own appliances on its own soil, and why the lessons of Camco's collapse are more urgent today than ever. Welcome inside the factory floor on Longwood Road, Hamilton, Ontario, where, for nearly a century, Canada built the machines that built Canadian homes, and where one day the assembly lines fell silent and never started again. The Rise, 1897, Longwood Road, Hamilton, Ontario. Long before Camco existed, before the merger documents were signed, before the brand names were unified under a single corporate roof, the site on Longwood Road in Hamilton was already one of the most important industrial addresses in Canadian history. In 1897, George Westinghouse himself chose Hamilton, Ontario, as the location for the first Westinghouse manufacturing operation outside of the United States. He built a factory on Sanford Avenue to produce air brakes for the booming rail industry. Hamilton was the Steel City. It was close to the American border, close to Toronto's markets, serviced by rail connections in every direction. It was exactly the kind of city that great industrial companies chose when they needed to manufacture at scale. Over the following decades, Westinghouse grew and diversified its Hamilton operations. By the early 20th century, the company was producing electric ranges, refrigerators, and washing machines from its Hamilton plants. In 1912, the cornerstone was laid for what would become the office and laboratory building at the Longwood Road site, the same building that would one day, in 2009, be renovated into the atrium at McMaster Innovation Park. The walls went up as a classic example of industrial modernist architecture, a building that shared design sensibility with Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Administration Building. Those walls were built to last. The Hamilton factory hummed through both world wars. During the Second World War, one of the manufacturing buildings on the site was repurposed to produce tanks and torpedoes. The same workers who had been assembling kitchen appliances before the war were now producing weapons. That is the kind of industrial flexibility that defined Hamilton's manufacturing culture, a city that could pivot its production capacity in service of whatever the nation needed most. After the war, General Electric deepened its Canadian presence. Canadian General Electric, incorporated in Canada in 1892 as a merger of the Edison Electric Light Company of Canada and the Thomson-Houston Electric Light Company of Canada, had been a major industrial force in Ontario for decades. It had appliance manufacturing facilities of its own. It was producing under the GE brand. And it was watching with close attention as General Steelwares, the other major Canadian appliance conglomerate, was building a portfolio of brands that included McClary, Moffat, and Easy. 2 great industrial forces were heading toward each other on a collision course that would eventually produce the largest appliance company the country had ever seen. But before that collision, something else was assembling beneath the surface of the industry. The energy before the contrast was building, the plants were running, the workers were employed, the brands were strong. And nobody standing on the Longwood Road factory floor in 1975 could have imagined that within 30 years, every machine in every building would be gone, replaced by something that had nothing to do with refrigerators at all. The coming merger would not be the beginning of a new era, it would be the beginning of the last one. The Rise. December 1976, Toronto, Ontario. The document that created Camco was signed in December of 1976. Its full name was the Canadian Appliance Manufacturing Company Limited. Its ownership structure was straightforward. General Electric Canada Incorporated held 60% of the shares, and General Steelwares Incorporated, known as GSW, held the remaining 40%. Both companies were based in Toronto. The merger brought together the appliance manufacturing capabilities of the two largest players in the Canadian market, creating an entity with immediate dominance. 1 month later, in January of 1977, Camco moved further and acquired the appliance division of Westinghouse Canada Limited. The deal brought into Camco's portfolio the Longwood Road site in Hamilton, the factory with the century-old industrial legacy, the modernist office building, the rail connections, the skilled workforce. It also brought a significant complication. Camco was not permitted to use the Westinghouse name or logo. That brand had been claimed by White Consolidated Industries when it purchased the appliance division of Westinghouse Electric, the parent company. So Camco took the plant, but had to rebrand the products. The Westinghouse appliances manufactured at the Hamilton site were relaunched under the Hotpoint name instead. The result was a company that manufactured under 5 distinct brand names: General Electric, Hotpoint, Moffett, McClary, and Beaumont. Each had its own market positioning, its own customer loyalty, its own retail relationships. Camco also manufactured private label appliances for major Canadian department stores, including the Bay and Simpsons, under the Beaumark name. The company was not just the largest appliance manufacturer in Canada, it was the manufacturer for virtually every major retail channel that sold appliances in Canada. The Hamilton plant, the former Westinghouse facility on Longwood Road, became the flagship manufacturing location. Joining it were plants in Montreal, in Weston, in London, and in Orangeville, all in Ontario or Quebec. The new company commanded approximately 30% of the Canadian major appliance market from its first day of operation. Its competitors, Inglis, which was 43% owned by Whirlpool, and White, which was almost entirely owned by Electrolux of Sweden, were formidable. But they were not Camco. Nobody was. The workforce the company inherited was experienced, unionized, and deeply connected to their specific communities. At the Hamilton plant, workers belonged to the United Electrical Workers. They had built their careers inside those Longwood Road buildings. Some had started when the site was still Westinghouse. Others had come in with the GE era. The plant's employment at this point stood at levels that would not be seen again after the middle of the following decade. The energy was real, the foundation was solid, the workforce was ready, and the brands were household names from coast to coast. But the warning sign was already there, embedded in the ownership structure. 60% was controlled by General Electric, an American company with interests that extended far beyond Camco's Canadian balance sheet. That imbalance of power between the majority shareholder in Fairfield, Connecticut, and the minority shareholder in Toronto would eventually destroy the entire enterprise. The Rise. 1982, Hamilton, Ontario. In June of 1982, Camco made the announcement that defined its ambitions. The company would spend $75 million to expand the Hamilton plant on Longwood Road. $75 million. At the same time, it announced the closure of the Weston plant, consolidating refrigerator and stove production into Hamilton. The logic was concentration, building one world-class facility rather than spreading capability across multiple smaller ones. Opponents of the move argued that Western workers would lose their livelihoods or their seniority. The company argued that concentration was the only path to competing against international manufacturers, as Canadian tariffs were scheduled to decline toward 12.5% by 1987. In the end, the closure proceeded. Western workers who chose to transfer were guaranteed their previous union status at the Hamilton facility. The consolidation gave Hamilton everything: the refrigerator lines, the stove lines, the expanded production floor, the capital investment. And for several years, it worked exactly as planned. The Hamilton plant was performing so well that in 1986, the London plant, another Camco facility, was closed, and its operations transferred to Hamilton as well. The annual report for 1986 contained a number that nobody in the Canadian appliance industry had ever seen before. Camco's sales income had reached $500 million, $500 million. It was the first time any Canadian appliance manufacturer had crossed that threshold. The company credited what it called its rationalization scheme, the application of scientific management principles to maximize efficiency and productivity, as well as a growing share of the United States export market. Employment at the Hamilton plant peaked at approximately 1,500 workers in the mid-1980s. The factory was running at capacity. The products were moving. The brands were strong. This was Camco at its absolute summit. This was the contrast at its most vivid. A factory employing 1,500 people, producing appliances for all of Canada and a growing piece of the United States, standing as the undisputed champion of Canadian manufacturing. And then something nobody wanted to name out loud began to emerge. On May 25, 1987, the Hamilton plant workers walked out. It was their second strike in 4 years. The walkout lasted 12.5 weeks. Workers did not return until August 20th. Even so, the company posted rising profits that year. The strike had not broken the enterprise, but it signaled something important about the tension building inside the plant's walls, between the workers who had given their working lives to this factory and the corporate ownership structure that was beginning to look at the global appliance market and wonder whether Canadian production still made economic sense. Camco in 1987 was at its peak, but the peak is the moment that contains the fall. The numbers were about to start moving in the wrong direction, and they would not stop. The peak, 1989, Hamilton, Ontario. In 1989, Camco became the main supplier of dryers and dishwashers for its parent company, General Electric, in the United States market. This was the moment the company had been building towards since its founding, the recognition by GE that Canadian manufacturing could serve the massive American market as a competitive supplier. The Montreal plant benefited most directly from this arrangement. Its dryer and dishwasher lines were well positioned for the export volumes. Hamilton, by contrast, focused on refrigerators and stoves, categories where the competitive landscape was about to shift in ways the Canadian operation could not control. The 1989 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and the United States was supposed to be the mechanism that would allow Canadian manufacturers to compete on equal terms with American rivals. For Camco, the early results were mixed. The export opportunity was real. The company was selling into the American market at volumes that would have been impossible before the agreement. But the same agreement that opened the American market also removed the tariff protection that had made Canadian manufacturing economically viable against lower-cost competitors. By the end of 1991, only 900 workers remained at the Hamilton plant, compared with 1,500 in 1984. 600 jobs gone in 7 years. The company responded to slumping domestic sales and excess inventory by shutting the plant down for 3 weeks at various points, conducting emergency rounds of layoffs, and investing additional capital in modernization programs designed to drive the cost per unit down. None of it was enough to reverse the trajectory. In February of 1992, the union at the Hamilton plant agreed to a shortened work week. Workers would receive 3 days of unemployment insurance payments per week to offset the income they lost from the reduced hours. It was a quiet accommodation, a way of managing the deterioration without naming it directly. Meanwhile, the structural tension inside the company's ownership was hardening into legal conflict. GSW, the minority partner with 20% of Camco's shares, filed a lawsuit against GE in 1992, alleging shareholder oppression. The allegation was specific, that General Electric, as majority owner, was making decisions that favored GE's broader corporate interests over the interests of Camco as a standalone business. The case was eventually settled out of court, but the settlement resolved nothing fundamental. GSW's complaint was correct. GE was using Camco as a vehicle for its own North American manufacturing strategy, which meant that whenever GE could source appliances more cheaply from elsewhere, it would do so, regardless of what that decision meant for Canadian workers on Longwood Road. The warning inside the numbers was visible. The warning inside the ownership structure was visible. The problem was already there for anyone willing to look. The peak. 1999, Hamilton, Ontario. In 1999, Camco announced what it described as the single largest investment in its 22-year history. The company was pouring capital into the Hamilton plant. New equipment, new production lines, new capacity. The announcement had the feel of a vote of confidence, evidence that the majority shareholder believed in the future of Canadian manufacturing and was prepared to back that belief with dollars. Workers who had been living through years of declining headcount and shortened work weeks could look at that investment and feel, at least briefly, that the plant had a future. The annual review for 1999 reported that Camco had sales of $638,300,000 and a total workforce of approximately 2,200 people across all its Canadian operations. After 22 years in existence, the company continued to be the country's #1 manufacturer of major appliances. The headquarters were moved from Mississauga to Hamilton in May of 2000, consolidating the corporate leadership with the flagship manufacturing operation. Hamilton was, officially, the home of Camco's identity. Employment at the Hamilton plant at this moment still numbered 1,200 workers, not the 1,500 of the mid-1980s peak, but a substantial workforce by any measure. 350 trailers of oranges, to borrow a phrase from another industry, were arriving at the plant each day in season-equivalent terms. The raw materials, the component parts, the steel and plastic and copper wire were moving through that facility at a scale that most people on the street would have found extraordinary to witness. But the contrast that was coming was already in motion. General Electric had restructured its global manufacturing strategy throughout the 1990s. Samsung of South Korea was building a plant in Mexico to compete directly against Whirlpool and Camco across North America. Chinese manufacturers were producing 12-cubic-foot refrigerators at costs that no Canadian factory, regardless of how efficiently it was organized, could match. The 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement had opened the border to Mexican goods. The tariff walls that had protected Canadian production were almost entirely gone. In February of 2003, Globe and Mail reporting made the situation explicit. Camco was warning that it might sell or close the Hamilton refrigerator plant, cutting up to 1,500 jobs. GE could buy refrigerators cheaper from outside contractors in the United States, Mexico, and China. Neil Gartshaw, Camco's chief financial officer, was quoted directly. "We are up against global manufacturers in places like China, Mexico, South Korea, and even the United States." The 1999 investment had not been a vote of confidence. It had been a last attempt to delay an outcome that GE's procurement strategy had already made inevitable. The urgency that nobody was saying openly was already consuming the factory. The peak, 1985, across Canada. Walk through the kitchen department of any major Canadian department store in 1985. Any Eaton's, any Bay, any Simpsons, and Camco was everywhere. Not always under its own name, not always with its corporate logo visible. But the products sitting on those showroom floors, the refrigerators with their gleaming white enamel doors, the electric ranges with their precise burner controls, the dishwashers with their engineering-grade stainless interiors. An enormous portion of them had been manufactured on Longwood Road in Hamilton, or at the Montreal dryer plant, or at one of the other Camco facilities that had been absorbed into the Hamilton operation. The General Electric brand had the deepest penetration. GE appliances were understood by Canadian consumers as premium, reliable, engineered to last. The Hotpoint brand sat in a slightly more accessible tier, reliable but not aspirational. Moffat and McClary were the Canadian heritage names, the brands that had been part of the kitchen landscape since before most consumers were born. The Moffat Stove Company had been founded in 1892 in Western Toronto. Thomas Lang Moffat had started an iron and brass castings company in Dundas, Ontario, and eventually built a stove manufacturer that became part of General Steel Wares, which became part of Camco. The Moffat brand carried the weight of Canadian domestic history in its name. So did McClary, a London, Ontario company dating to the 19th century, one of the founding members of General Steel Wares. When Camco put those brand names on a refrigerator or a stove, it was not just attaching a label, it was invoking decades of trust. Canadian families who had owned a Moffat stove in the 1950s bought another Moffat stove in the 1970s. The brand loyalty was generational and genuine. Camco understood this. Its market dominance was not simply a function of manufacturing efficiency, it was a function of emotional connection that had been built over the span of an entire century of Canadian domestic life. The Beaumark line, manufactured by Camco for the Bay and Simpsons department stores under their private label brand, extended this reach further. Consumers who did not specifically choose GE or Moffat by name, but simply walked into the appliance section of a major department store and pointed at a refrigerator, those consumers were often taking home a Camco product whether they knew it or not. By the mid-1980s, the Canadian appliance industry had consolidated from the 36 companies that had been operating in 1964 down to 3 full-line competitors: Camco, Inglis, and White. The market had been rationalized. Camco held 30%. It was, by any standard of measurement, dominant. The urgency of what came next was not that it was unexpected, it was that it should have been prepared for. The warning was already in the competitive pressure from the early 1980s imports. The warning was in the tariff reductions scheduled for 1987. The warning was in Samsung's Mexican plant. Every signal was pointing in the same direction, and the response was always to invest more in the existing plant, to rationalize more aggressively, to hope that Canadian efficiency could beat global cost structures. It could not. The peak. May 25, 1987, Hamilton, Ontario. When the Hamilton plant workers walked out on May 25, 1987, it was the second strike at the facility in 4 years. The workers were members of the local affiliated with the United Electrical Workers and, subsequently, the Canadian Auto Workers, a union that under the leadership of Bob White had separated from the American-based United Auto Workers in 1985 to form an independent Canadian labour organisation. The walkout lasted 12.5 weeks. The workers returned on August 20th. The timing of the strike, at the peak of Camco's market dominance, when the annual report had just confirmed $500 million in sales income and rising profits, revealed the tension that was building inside the plant's walls. Workers were looking at the financial success of the company they had helped build and asking a direct question: why were the benefits of that success not reflected more concretely in their wages and working conditions? The company, for its part, was already aware that the tariff reductions scheduled for the following years would increase competitive pressure significantly. What management was willing to pay workers in 1987 was being calculated in the context of what it expected to be able to pay workers in 1992. The strike was settled, the workers returned, the profits continued to rise that year. On the surface, it appeared that the dispute had resolved without permanent damage, but the strike had exposed something that the annual reports could not capture. The workers of the Hamilton plant were not simply labour inputs to a manufacturing process. They were the human infrastructure of an industry, people who had built their careers, their mortgages, their families' futures around the assumption that those production lines would keep running. When Shirley Milne, who would be a 25-year Camco employee when the closure announcement came in 2003, chose the Hamilton plant as her place of work, she was choosing a foundation she believed would hold. When Ed Lindsay, another 20-year employee, said in 2003 that he had thought he would be there until he retired, he was describing a relationship between worker and employer that had been built on decades of institutional reliability. The strike of 1987 did not shake that foundation, but it revealed that the foundation had cracks in it that nobody at the negotiating table was prepared to acknowledge. The CAW representative Steve Farkas, speaking 16 years later, would describe the closing as the inevitable result of free trade and globalization, allowing cheaper offshore appliances to flood the North American market. He was right, but the trajectory of that flooding had been visible from the mid-1980s. The urgency nobody wanted to name was already alive. Then something arrived that changed the calculus permanently, and the workers on Longwood Road would not know about it until it was far too late to matter. The decline. 1989 to 1994. North America. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement came into effect in January of 1989. For Camco, the immediate effect was a significant expansion of export opportunity. The company became the primary supplier of dryers and dishwashers to General Electric in the United States. The Montreal plant benefited enormously. GE committed to purchasing 800,000 dryers per year from the Montreal facility, up from 400,000, a doubling of the volume that justified a $14.9 million expansion investment in that plant. Hamilton was a different story. The refrigerators and stoves produced there faced competition that the export volumes could not offset. And the North American Free Trade Agreement of 1994, which added Mexico to the trade zone, accelerated the competitive pressure from a direction that Camco's production economics could not survive. Samsung of South Korea was building a plant in Mexico, specifically to compete against Whirlpool and Camco across the North American market. Samsung had estimated sales of $2.2 billion and employed 18,000 workers globally. Maybay of Mexico, a company with 13 manufacturing plants across Latin America, of which 8 were in Mexico, was already in a supply relationship with General Electric, exporting kitchen ranges and refrigerators to the United States under the GE brand. Maybay had sales of $2.2 billion and the flexibility of lower-cost Mexican labor and production infrastructure. Against that competition, the Hamilton plant was manufacturing 12 cubic-foot refrigerators and electric ranges for a market that GE was simultaneously sourcing from China, Mexico, and South Korea. The logic of GE's procurement strategy was not hostile to Camco. It was simply rational. GE would buy appliances from the lowest cost compliant supplier available. When that supplier was Camco's Hamilton plant, Camco got the order. When that supplier was a Chinese factory producing refrigerators at a cost the Hamilton plant could not match, the Chinese factory got the order. The Canadian workers on Longwood Road were competing not just against foreign factories, they were competing against the strategic preferences of their own majority shareholder. By 1995, employment at the Hamilton plant had fallen to just 700 workers, less than half the 1,500 who had worked there at peak. Annual sales had decreased again. The cost of materials had increased. Another round of layoffs followed. The abbreviated work week that the union had agreed to in 1992 had become the permanent condition of employment at the facility. GSW filed a second shareholder oppression lawsuit against GE in late 2000, having already settled a similar case out of court in 1992. The new case alleged that GE was using its majority ownership position in Camco to serve its own broader corporate interests, specifically by directing its procurement to non-Camco suppliers when that served GE's global strategy, at the expense of all Camco shareholders, including the minority. The case was still active when the closure announcement came in October of 2003. The warning signs had been ignored for a decade. The end was no longer coming, it had arrived. The decline. October 17, 2003. Hamilton, Ontario. On October 17, 2003, Camco's CEO James Fleck stood before cameras and released a statement that contained 2 sentences worth examining for everything they revealed and concealed simultaneously. The first: "This was not the announcement we wanted to make today." The second: "It has been a very difficult decision to reach." What the announcement said was this: the Hamilton plant, which manufactured electric ranges and 2 models of refrigerators, would close in December of 2004. 800 employees would lose their jobs, 730 unionized workers and 70 salaried employees. The company would take a $64 million after-tax charge in the 4th quarter for the plant shutdown. The charge covered severance, pension wind-up expenses, and asset write-downs. Within hours of the announcement, shares in Camco on the Toronto Stock Exchange collapsed to a low of $1.15, a drop of nearly 48% in a single trading session. The stock had been trading at $2.20. By the close of trading, the shares had partially recovered to $1.75, still down 45 cents or 20%. From the previous October's 52-week high of $3.05, the share price represented the complete destruction of investor confidence. The human response was immediate and unambiguous. Shirley Milne, a 25-year employee at the Hamilton plant, said to Hamilton television station CHCH, "I'm very upset. I'm in shock. I knew something was up, but when you hear it, I've been here 25 years, it's like, now what am I going to do? It's affected a lot of people." Ed Lindsay, a 20-year employee, said, "It's very viable for its location, and I just thought I'd be there until I retired." Buzz Hargrove, president of the Canadian Auto Workers, called the plant another victim of the free trade agreements between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. His accounting was precise. Since the free trade agreement was signed in 1989, approximately 15,000 jobs had been lost in the white goods industry in Canada. The Hamilton plant's 800 were not exceptional. They were the last in a series. The CAW representative, Steve Farkas, who would be responsible for helping find new employment for the displaced workers, was not optimistic. "Hopefully the economy will pick up a little bit so we can place people," he said. "We're talking about a hell of a lot of people to place here." The average age of Hamilton plant workers at the time of the closure announcement was just under 50 years old. These were not young workers who could easily retrain and relaunch their careers. These were workers who had spent 20 and 25 years inside a single facility, building expertise in appliance manufacturing that the Canadian economy was no longer prepared to value. The announcement that James Fleck described as difficult had been made inevitable years earlier, but nobody had told the workers that until October 17th. The fall. December 2004. Longwood Road, Hamilton, Ontario. The Hamilton plant ran its last production shift in December of 2004. The electric ranges and 12 cubic foot refrigerators that had been coming off the assembly lines on Longwood Road for nearly 3 decades, and off the Westinghouse lines before them for decades more, stopped. The conveyors went still. The workers clocked out for the last time. 690 union employees and 56 salaried workers were processed through their termination arrangements. In mid-January of 2004, unionized workers at the plant had voted overwhelmingly to accept the closing agreement struck between the Canadian auto workers and the plant ownership. The vote was not a surprise. The workers understood the arithmetic. The alternative to accepting the severance arrangement was no arrangement at all. The financial accounting of the closure was staggering in its specificity. The company reported a fourth quarter loss of $53.4 million, the $64 million after-tax charge in full. Full-year annual revenue had declined to $595 million from $665 million the year prior. The profit that had been $11.1 million in 2002 had become a full-year loss of $52.5 million. GE's Consumer Products division had begun buying 12 cubic foot refrigeration models from a lower-cost supplier in the second quarter of 2003. Sales of dishwashers to GE had been reduced. The rising Canadian dollar had eroded the value of United States export sales. The machinery of the closure was cold and precise. $9 million had already been recorded for employee severance costs. An additional $18.4 million in severance would follow. The pension wind-up expenses and asset write-downs made up the balance of the $64 million charge. The Hamilton head office, which employed about 100 additional people in sales, marketing and distribution, was closed as well. Camco's headquarters moved out of Hamilton. The city that had been home to the company's corporate leadership since the year 2000 was no longer the center of anything. What remained after the closure? A Montreal plant employing 800 workers making clothes dryers and dishwashers, with GE having committed to purchasing 800,000 dryers per year through 2010, a call center in Moncton, New Brunswick, and sales and service locations across Canada. Camco was transitioning from a manufacturer into what amounted to a distributor. The company had already signed a deal with Samsung Canada to distribute Samsung's refrigerators, washers, and dryers. The irony was complete. The Korean company, whose Mexican plant had helped drive Camco's Hamilton operation to closure, was now supplying products that Camco would sell to Canadian consumers under its own distribution network. The plant that had employed 1,500 workers at its peak, that had generated $500 million in sales in a single year, that had been the flagship of Canadian appliance manufacturing for nearly 3 decades, had become an empty building on Longwood Road. Then, in July of 2005, came the announcement that completed the picture. The fall. July 2005. Hamilton and Montreal. On a Monday morning in July of 2005, the financial markets received an announcement that most observers had not seen coming. Mexico-based Controladora Mabe S.A. was making an offer to acquire Camco. The offer price was $3.52 per share, a premium of 51.3% over Friday's closing price of $2.30 on the Toronto Stock Exchange. When markets opened on the Monday, Camco's shares surged to $3.48. In the weeks following, the shares would rise further as the deal progressed toward completion. Rafael Nava, Mabe's public relations general manager, described the acquisition as the company's first manufacturing venture north of the American border. Mabe, at the time of the offer, had 13 manufacturing plants across Latin America, 8 of them in Mexico, and estimated annual sales of $2.2 billion and 18,000 employees. Its existing relationship with General Electric, which had made Mabe an exporter of ranges and refrigerators to the United States under the GE brand, was the logic of the acquisition. GE, which held 51% of Camco, was, in effect, moving its Canadian affiliate from one corporate family to another within its own supply network. GSW, which still held its 20% minority stake in Camco, declared in a press release that any transaction would not impact the ongoing litigation between GSW and GE for oppression of the minority. John Barford, GSW's chairman, had previously stated publicly that GE had not done enough to help Camco prosper. The litigation filed in late 2000 was, according to court records, essentially inactive by the time the Mabe offer arrived. GSW reviewed the fairness of Mabe's offer. The deal required approval from holders of at least 75.5% of outstanding shares to proceed to a private takeover. The transaction closed. Mabe took control of Camco. The Hamilton plant property, the 37-acre site on Longwood Road, was sold separately to McMaster University for $13 million in January of 2005. Before the full MABE acquisition was concluded, McMaster announced plans to build a research park on the property. The city of Hamilton committed $5 million toward the development of a biotechnology incubator on the site. The factory floor, where 1,500 workers had assembled refrigerators and stoves, would become the McMaster Innovation Park, a research and technology campus focused on automotive materials, advanced manufacturing, and biomedical engineering. The atrium at MIP, opened in October of 2009 after a $17 million renovation, was the only structure from the original Westinghouse manufacturing plant still standing. It dated from 1912. Its walls had seen nearly a century of industrial history. The remaining Camco entity, the Montreal dryer plant and the distribution network, continued under MABE's ownership. But the Montreal plant's future was no more secure than Hamilton's had been. The fall. August 2014. Montreal, Quebec. For the workers at the Montreal Camco plant, renamed MABE Canada after the 2005 acquisition, the shutdown of the Hamilton facility in 2004 had been alarming but not immediately personal. The Montreal operation had been expanding. GE had committed to purchasing 800,000 dryers per year through 2010. The provincial government of Quebec, through Investissement Québec, had contributed financing to the Montreal expansion, conditional on the company maintaining employment at its current level of 800 workers through to 2010. The Montreal plant had, for a moment, looked like the survivor, the part of Camco's manufacturing legacy that would endure. It did not endure. In August of 2014, MABE Canada closed the Montreal plant. 2 weeks after the plant closure, the company declared bankruptcy. The consequences for the workforce were immediate and severe. The retirees and active employees of MABE Canada lost the equivalent of nearly 22% of their pension entitlements. Their group insurance and life insurance protection evaporated with the bankruptcy. Thousands of workers who had devoted their entire active careers to the plant, some under General Electric, some under Camco, some under MABE, found that the safety net they had been promised was gone. The parent company, Controladora Mabe of Mexico, was unaffected by the bankruptcy. It continued its operations across Latin America and the United States. The subsidiary declared bankruptcy and dissolved. The parent walked away. The workers who had remained through the Hamilton closure, who had continued to show up to the Montreal plant through the years of declining orders and increasing uncertainty, found themselves with a reduced pension and no recourse against a Mexican company that had structured its Canadian operations as a separate legal entity precisely so that the parent could not be held liable for the subsidiary's obligations. Unifor, the union formed in 2013 from the merger of the Canadian Auto Workers and the Communications, Energy and Paper Workers Union, represented the Montreal workers in the aftermath of the bankruptcy. A class action lawsuit was filed. The retirees and former employees launched a boycott campaign against GE, Hotpoint, McClary and Moffat brand appliances. The boycott was later expanded to include Haier, the major Chinese company that acquired a significant stake in GE's appliance division in 2016. As of 2024, 10 years after the bankruptcy, the group of retirees and former employees was still engaged in litigation. The proceedings had been drawn out over a decade by the company using procedural tactics that the workers and Unifor described as deliberate delays. The battle had not been won, but it had not been abandoned either. The factory was gone, the pension was diminished, the legal fight continued. This is what the end of Canadian appliance manufacturing looked like from the inside. The fall, 2005 to 2026. Longwood Road, Hamilton, Ontario. The 37-acre site that McMaster University purchased for $13 million in January of 2005 was not an empty lot. It was a collection of industrial buildings in various states of utility and decay, carrying the accumulated physical history of nearly a century of manufacturing. The demolition and site reclamation began in 2005. It proceeded methodically. Building by building, the structures that had housed Westinghouse's wartime torpedo production, that had contained Camco's assembly lines and warehouses and quality control stations, came down. The site was not uniform in its desolation. As late as 2016, portions of the former Camco warehouse were being used as a metal recycling plant. In February of 2020, police responded to reports of a body found inside one of the factory structures. It was a scrapper attempting to remove copper from an area where live power was still present. The building had not been formally decommissioned. The industrial past was still physically present, still dangerous, years after the last appliance had rolled off the production line. The atrium at McMaster Innovation Park, the former Westinghouse and Camco office building completed in 1912, renovated at a cost of $17 million between 2005 and 2009, was the sole survivor. The grand opening took place in October of 2009. The building houses over 114 tenants, ranging from startup companies and technology accelerators to research laboratories. It is described by McMaster Innovation Park as the only remaining office building that was part of the Camco manufacturing plant that operated in Hamilton for almost a century. It had been designed by William P. Souter and Associates in the tradition of modernist industrial architecture. Its floor plans share characteristics with Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Administration Building. The building is graceful and well-proportioned, a genuinely significant piece of early 20th century industrial design. In 2013, the former Camco warehouse was repurposed as the McMaster Automotive Resource Center, a 92,000 square foot facility for transportation research with a focus on battery technology and hybrid drivetrains. In 2018, additional portions of the former warehouse became the Biomedical Engineering and Advanced Manufacturing Facility. The McMaster Innovation Park plans to expand from its current 500,000 square foot footprint to 2.5 million square feet over the coming decade. Where refrigerators were assembled, lithium batteries are now studied. Where stoves were tested, automotive safety research is conducted. The transformation is complete, and it is genuinely impressive as a piece of urban repurposing. But the workers of the Hamilton plant, the ones who were, on average, just under 50 years old when the closure was announced, who had spent 20 and 25 years inside those buildings, did not benefit from the transformation. They were not the researchers in the atrium. They were the displaced, the retrained if lucky, the retired early if they could afford it. The building stood, the workers were gone, and the industry they represented had been erased from Canada's economic map so thoroughly that most Canadians today have no idea their kitchen appliances were once manufactured domestically by Canadians in factories like this one. The fall, 1989 to 2026, across Canada. The numbers tell the story with a clarity that no amount of policy language can obscure. In 1964, 36 companies manufactured washing machines, stoves, and refrigerators in Canada, employing 10,000 workers. By the time the Hamilton plant closed in December of 2004, there were effectively 4 firms with approximately 2,500 workers, and that number was about to shrink further. By the time MABE Canada declared bankruptcy in August of 2014, the Canadian major appliance manufacturing industry had been reduced to a fraction of its former size, concentrated in a handful of facilities whose survival was contingent on decisions made in boardrooms in Fairfield, Connecticut and Mexico City. Buzz Hargrove's accounting in 2003 that 15,000 appliance manufacturing jobs had been lost in Canada since the Free Trade Agreement was signed in 1989 was not disputed by anyone in the industry. It was simply accepted as fact, the way the loss of a limb is eventually accepted after the initial shock has passed. The brands survived the factories. GE appliances are still sold in Canada. Hotpoint appliances are still sold in Canada. Moffat appliances are still sold in Canada. McClary appliances are still sold in Canada. They are manufactured elsewhere, in Mexico, in China, in South Korea, and distributed by companies that have no manufacturing presence in Canada at all. The names that Canadian families trusted for generations. The names that carried the weight of a domestic industrial history stretching back to the 19th century are now labels on products that were never touched by a Canadian worker's hands. The free trade agreements that were presented to Canadian workers and voters as pathways to expanded opportunity delivered expanded competition without the protective infrastructure that would have allowed Canadian manufacturing to survive the transition. Samsung's Mexican plant, producing appliances at labor costs that Canadian union wages could not match, was the direct and predictable consequence of a trade architecture that removed tariff protections without addressing the wage and regulatory differentials that made fair competition impossible. What Camco built, the brands, the market share, the manufacturing expertise, the training programs, the union relationships, the community stability, was not an accident. It was the product of decades of deliberate investment in Canadian industrial capacity. What killed it was the deliberate decision made by a majority shareholder in Fairfield, Connecticut, to source from wherever the cost was lowest. The Canadian workers were not uncompetitive because they were inefficient. They were uncompetitive because they were paid Canadian wages in a market that had opened itself to the products of work workers paid Mexican and Chinese wages without any mechanism to bridge the gap. The urgency of that lesson has not diminished. It has grown. Stand on Longwood Road in Hamilton, Ontario, right now, today, in 2026, and look at what occupies the 37 acres where Camco once stood. Then, 1,500 workers arriving before dawn, assembling refrigerators and stoves under brand names that had been trusted by Canadian families since the 19th century, generating $500 million in sales in a single year, producing 30% of every major appliance purchased in Canada. Now, research laboratories, technology accelerators, startup incubators, a building renovated for $17 million, whose tenants include over 114 organizations working on battery technology, automotive safety, and biomedical engineering. Beautiful, forward-looking, completely disconnected from the working-class lives that were built inside those walls for nearly a century. Three things cannot be recovered once they are gone. The first is the institutional knowledge of a workforce. The workers who assembled refrigerators on Longwood Road for 20 and 25 years carried expertise that cannot be replicated by a retraining program. They understood the tolerances of the machines, the physical demands of the production line, the craft of manufacturing at scale. When those workers dispersed, when Shirley Milne walked out of the Hamilton plant for the last time after 25 years, when Ed Lindsay accepted a severance package instead of the retirement he had planned, that knowledge left with them and was never systematically preserved or transferred. The second thing that cannot be recovered is the supply chain that sustained the factory. 350 trailers of components arriving daily during peak season. The local suppliers, the regional logistics networks, the small businesses that existed because the Hamilton plant existed. All of that was dismantled and cannot be simply reassembled. Industrial supply chains are built over decades. They collapse in a single closure announcement. The third thing that cannot be recovered is the community stability that a large manufacturing employer provides. The average age of a Hamilton Camco worker in 2003 was just under 50. The Canadian Auto Workers representative Steve Farkas said in October of that year that he was not optimistic about finding new employment for those workers. He was correct. The retraining programs available in 2004 to a 50-year-old who had spent 20 years operating a refrigerator assembly line were not pathways to comparable employment. They were exits from the working class. The path not taken was the path that other countries, Germany, South Korea, Japan, chose when facing similar competitive pressures from low-cost manufacturers. Strategic industrial policy that maintained domestic production capacity through targeted support, managed trade relationships, and deliberate investment in manufacturing innovation. Canada dismantled its protective tariffs, signed its trade agreements, and trusted that the market would create replacement employment for the workers who would be displaced. The workers of the Hamilton Camco plant are still waiting. The building where they worked is now an innovation park. The brands they built their careers manufacturing are now made in Mexico and China. The pension that some of them were promised was delivered at 22 cents on the dollar. And the last major white goods manufacturing plant in Ontario, as Buzz Hargrove accurately described it in 2003, has been replaced by a research campus that is genuinely impressive and completely irrelevant to the lives of the people it displaced. That is the whole story, and it is not over.